Usually when we talk about a modern military operation, there's this immense, almost subconscious expectation of surgical precision.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a medical procedure, right? You find the tumor, the laser targets it down to the absolute millimeter, you remove it, and the doctor points to the post-op scan and says, there, it's gone. Problem solved.
Right. The body is healthy again. We deeply crave that kind of absolute visible certainty.
Yeah, we really do.
We want the world to be clean,
Yeah.
binary. You
Yeah.
apply the fix, the problem disappears, and everything just goes back to normal.
But the paradox here is that geopolitics isn't a passive physical body. When you step into the world of actual modern warfare, that pristine laser scalpel you just used doesn't just remove the tumor.
No, it really doesn't.
The body actively fights back against the scalpel. The patient wakes up, grabs your wrist, and suddenly that perfect microscopic incision is causing a massive internal hemorrhage that you can't even see on the monitors.
Yeah, the precision of the tool completely blinds you to the chaos it just unleashed. It is the absolute definition of a strategic blind spot.
Exactly.
You're so focused on the perfection of the strike that you completely ignore the anatomy of the reaction. And the terrifying consequences of that exact blind spot are playing out right in front of us.
Which is exactly why we're here today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. It is Thursday, March 26th, 2026.
A very heavy day.
Yeah. And unless you have been completely off the grid, living in a cabin with no Wi-Fi, you know that a massive, incredibly complex, and honestly rapidly escalating military crisis is currently unfolding with Iran.
It's dominating every headline, every single news cycle.
Every market ticker. It's literally dictating the price of the gas you put in your car this morning.
Oh yeah, the economic shockwaves are already here.
But today, we're doing what we do best. We are taking you past those chaotic, anxiety-inducing 6-second news sound bites.
Right, we need to look deeper.
We are looking for the hidden mechanics of politics. How did we actually get here? And to do that, we are diving into a gripping, highly detailed transcript of an interview from the YouTube channel Trigonometry.
It's a fantastic interview.
It really is. They sat down with Professor Robert Pape to discuss a terrifying concept he calls the escalation trap.
And we really need to establish right up front who Professor Pape is.
Please do, because that's important.
Yeah, because the media landscape right now is just flooded with people giving their opinions on this.
Yeah.
But Pape is not just another cable news pundit throwing hot takes at a wall for ratings.
Right.
His credibility on the specific mechanics of air power and strategy is staggering. I mean, his background is wild.
Tell them how he started, because I love this detail.
Yeah, so he started out as a kid who wanted to be a UN interpreter, but he ended up going to the library to find the definitive book on why the United States lost the Vietnam War.
Because we had all this overwhelming, unchallenged air power, right?
Exactly. He wanted to know the mechanics of that failure. And when he realized that comprehensive data-driven book didn't actually exist, he decided to just write it for his PhD dissertation.
As you do. Just casually write the definitive book.
Right. But his career trajectory is what really matters for our context today. Running through the first Gulf War, because he had done all this foundational, incredibly nerdy work on the historical data of air campaigns, he suddenly became the guy everyone in the Pentagon was listening to.
Out of the blue.
Pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. Air Force called him up while they were actively bombing Baghdad, by the way, and asked him to come down to Maxwell Air Force Base.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Okay.
Because picture this. He is literally standing in front of the best U.S. Air Force pilots in the world.
4-star generals sitting in the back of the room.
Right. He is teaching mid-level officers who already know exactly, down to the rivet, how to put a bomb on a target. He isn't teaching them how to fly.
No, they already know that.
He's teaching them the strategy of why they're flying, and more importantly, what happens the day after the bomb drops.
Exactly. And for the last 20-plus years, he has advised every single White House, Democrat, Republican, it genuinely does not matter.
He's totally nonpartisan in his analysis.
Completely. He has been modeling this exact, specific, hypothetical war with Iran for 21 years in his advanced strategy classes at the University of Chicago.
21 years.
Yeah. So when he speaks on this, he is speaking from decades of rigorous, peer-reviewed, heavily scrutinized simulation and historical data.
Now, before we get into the heavy machinery of this, we need to make something crystal clear to you, our listener.
Yes, very important.
This deep dive involves heavily charged political figures. We're going to be talking about Donald Trump, The government of Israel, the government of Iran, and highly sensitive, lethal military actions.
And we must emphasize,
But
we take absolutely no sides in this.
yeah,
None.
zero.
We are not endorsing the actions of any politician, any military, or any government mentioned in these sources.
Our mission today is purely to impartially map out the strategic realities, the historical precedents, and the specific ideas contained in Professor Pape's analysis.
We're just the messengers here.
Right, trying to help you read the geopolitical chessboard and understand the mechanics of how we arrived at March 2026.
We are looking at the cold, hard mechanics of how actions lead to reactions. That is the only lens we are using today.
So the entire crisis we are watching unfold right now actually starts with a foundational flaw in how modern leaders think about warfare. It's something Pape calls the smart bomb trap.
The smart bomb trap, yeah.
And it hinges on the massive, often ignored difference between tactics and strategy.
This is a crucial distinction that gets lost in almost every mainstream conversation about the military. I mean, tactics are the physical mechanics of the action.
With dropping the bomb.
Exactly. It's the pilot flying the F-35, acquiring the GPS coordinates, calculating the wind shear, and dropping the bomb so it hits exactly the building it's supposed to hit.
The actual physical act of destroying the physical thing?
That's tactics. Strategy, however, is the political outcome you want to achieve because you dropped that bomb.
Why did you blow up that building in the first place?
Right. Do you want the enemy to surrender? Do you want their government to collapse? Do you want them to come to the negotiating table and sign a treaty?
And the actual strategy lives in this incredibly messy, unpredictable, intensely human middle ground between the bomb exploding and the enemy leader deciding to sign a piece of paper.
And here's where the smart bomb trap springs shut. Pape argues that modern weapons are so exquisitely precise that they actually break the brains of the people sitting in the Situation Room.
Break their brains how?
We are talking about GPS-guided munitions that can drop from 30,000 feet up in the sky, fall through the atmosphere, and drop through a specific window of a specific building, hitting within a 15-foot radius.
That's insane precision.
It is. And it creates what he terms the illusion of precision control.
Think about how this applies to the intelligence briefings you see leaked on the news, or even just, as a citizen watching a press conference. You see a satellite photo of a perfectly destroyed building.
The blast radius is completely contained.
Right. The collateral damage is zero. And you naturally assume the threat is entirely neutralized. You don't realize you're falling for the exact same cognitive trap the generals are.
Because the weapon is precise, you think the outcome is precise.
Exactly. You see this hyper-precise technology, and it tricks you into believing that because your weapon is precise, your political outcome will also be equally precise and easily controlled. The sheer technological awe of the explosion blinds leaders to the long-term, chaotic political fallout.
Human nature plays a massive role here. Put yourself in the shoes of a multi-star general or a president. You are sitting in a highly classified, windowless room. The pressure is immense.
Unimaginable pressure.
Someone puts a tablet in front of you and shows you that you can drop a piece of metal from the stratosphere with a 15-foot margin of error. The immediate, intoxicating human reaction is, okay, which specific enemy leader can I eliminate with this?
It makes you feel like a god looking at a screen.
It really does.
But Pape points out that the U.S. has fallen for this exact trap before. It's not a new phenomenon. History is absolutely littered with the consequences of this illusion, and he brings up some really sobering examples.
Yeah, let's look at the mechanics of April 1986. President Ronald Reagan wants to punish Muammar Gaddafi of Libya for his sponsorship of terrorism.
Right.
It's the dawn of what we now call precision decapitation strikes. The U.S. military sends F-111 bombers on a massive, complex flight path from the U.K., and they target Gaddafi's actual residential compound.
Specifically aiming for his tent. Right.
Specifically his tent.
Right.
The bombs hit exactly where they were supposed to. It was a tactical marvel for 1986. They killed some of his family members, but Gaddafi had literally stepped out of the tent moments before the strike.
Oh, wow. So the tactic was a success in terms of hitting the geographical coordinates, but the strategy was a complete disaster.
Complete disaster.
It didn't pacify Gaddafi. It didn't make him surrender or rethink his life choices. It hardened him into a state of absolute fury.
And 2 years later, we see the strategic reaction. What happened? Gaddafi's intelligence services orchestrated the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland.
A horrible tragedy.
They planted a bomb in a cassette recorder inside a suitcase. It blew up a commercial airliner, killing 271 people, including 190 Americans. That was his brutal, delayed retaliation.
The precision strike on a tent in Libya did not grant the United States precision control over the long-term aftermath.
Not at all. And Pape gives another example, picking a Democrat this time, to show that this is a totally bipartisan psychological illusion.
Right, it affects everyone in that room.
Jump forward to March 1999. President Bill Clinton wants to stop the Serbian leader, Slobodan Milosevic, from crushing the pro-democracy and separatist movements in Kosovo.
What was the Situation Room plan there?
A quick, clean, 3-day precision air campaign hitting 51 specific high-value targets in Belgrade. The assumption, the strategic hope, was that a few perfect, undeniable strikes would shake the regime to its core, empower the doves and the moderates within the Serbian government, and force Milosevic to back down and pull his police forces out.
But let's look at the mechanics of the reaction. The bombs hit perfectly, tactical success, but the regime didn't fall. The doves weren't empowered.
Nope.
Instead, Milosevic was enraged. He ordered 30,000 heavily armed troops into Kosovo and engaged in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing. He forced 1 million Kosovars out of their homes.
50% of the civilians in that entire province were displaced.
A clean 3-day precision strike turned into a grueling 78-day war that ultimately required a massive ground army presence to finally resolve.
Pape mentions that the briefer for President Clinton later admitted to him, point blank, that it never even occurred to them in the planning stages that the Serbs would respond with that level of viciousness.
They couldn't even imagine it.
They simply couldn't imagine it. The technological perfection of their opening move completely blinded them to the reality of the opponent's inevitable, messy reaction.
I want to introduce an analogy here because I think it helps visualize this disconnect. Imagine you are playing chess against a seasoned grandmaster.
Okay.
But before the game starts, you are handed a computer program that guarantees you the absolute, mathematically flawless, most exquisite opening move in the history of chess.
A flawless start.
Right. You sit down, you play that perfect opening move, and because it was so undeniably flawless, it completely tricks your brain into thinking you were a chess god.
You get overconfident.
You lean back and think, well, if my opening is this perfect, I can easily control the messy middle game, and the end game is basically a foregone conclusion.
Right.
But the opening move doesn't win a game of chess. It just changes the geometry of the board. You still have to play the remaining 50 moves against a furious grandmaster who is now reacting, adapting, and countering your flawless opening.
What's fascinating here is that mechanical analogy aligns perfectly with military strategy. Pape's core thesis is that you cannot even begin to formulate a realistic endgame strategy until you've actually waded through that unpredictable middle game.
You don't know how you'll react.
Exactly. You don't know how the enemy will react to your perfect opening move until they actually reach out and move their piece.
And that brings us out of history and directly into the exact events of last June. This is how the smart bomb trap triggered the current 2026 nightmare.
Stage 1.
Right. We're moving from the psychological theory to the actual mechanics of stage 1, tactical success, strategic panic.
Let's lay out the groundwork of what actually happened, because the context spans decades here. The relationship between the U.S. and Iran over nuclear capabilities really shifted into high gear back in 2002.
That was the big discovery.
Yeah. That's when the United States discovered, via satellite and dissident intelligence, that Iran was digging massive, heavily fortified holes in the ground at places like Natanz. We are talking about excavations the size of multiple football fields, 100 feet deep into solid rock, preparing to enrich uranium.
And by 2005, the advanced centrifuges were going in.
Right. And Pape says this is the exact moment he started actively modeling the bombing of Iran in his war games.
Over 2 decades ago.
Over 2 decades ago. In fact, he predicted the precise tactic the U.S. would eventually use to a legendary investigative journalist named Seymour Hersh way back then.
Oh, interesting. What did Hersh think was going to happen?
Well, Hersh was convinced, based on the depth of the concrete, that the U.S. would have to use a tactical nuclear weapon to destroy these deep underground facilities.
A nuke? Wow.
But Pape told him, no, the political fallout of using a nuclear weapon is too high. We won't use a nuke. We will use a highly advanced double-tap precision attack.
All right. Let's really dig into the mechanics of this double tap because the engineering behind it is just staggering. We are talking about using 2,000-pound JDAMs, which are essentially massive dumb bombs strapped with a GPS tail kit that steers fins to guide it, or even the massive 30,000-pound MOABs.
The mother of all bombs.
Right. And remember how we talked about GPS guidance earlier? It isn't just two-dimensional latitude and longitude, it's three-dimensional. It includes altitude and depth.
Yes.
So the tactic works like this. You program the first massive bomb to hit the exact surface coordinates of the roof of the facility at net 10s or Fordo. It hits, detonates, and blasts a massive smoking crater into the dirt and reinforced concrete.
But here is the crazy part of the physics. You don't wait for the dust to settle to do damage assessment.
No.
You have already dropped a second bomb, timed to follow exactly 15 to 30 seconds behind the first one on the exact same trajectory.
You're just falling right behind it.
The second bomb dives right through the smoke, enters the newly created crater from the first bomb, and detonates 25 feet deeper into the earth. You're not just trying to burn the building down. You are systematically using high explosives as a massive hypersonic drill bit.
You are digging a hole to create a massive localized earthquake.
Exactly.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following the physics here. Why an earthquake? Why not just try to blow up the machines directly?
Because the centrifuges themselves, the machines spinning the uranium gas to enrich it, are incredibly delicate. They are spinning at supersonic speeds, thousands of rotations per minute, on highly calibrated magnetic bearings.
They're sensitive.
Very. If you create a violent enough seismic shock wave in the surrounding bedrock, the delicate harmonics of those thousands of centrifuges are disrupted. They wobble, crash into their casings, and literally tear themselves to pieces.
And last June, that is exactly what the United States military executed, the 12-day war. And exactly as Professor Pape predicted 20 years ago, it was a 90+% tactical success.
The bombs hit their exact coordinates.
The double tap drill worked. The localized earthquakes registered on seismographs. The centrifuges were undoubtedly destroyed as a functioning industrial production center.
Tactically, a massive success.
So wait, I have to genuinely push back here because this is the exact moment my brain falls into the trap. If we obliterated the facility, if we shook the machines to pieces, why wouldn't the threat just be over?
That's the trap.
Right, because if the centrifuges are twisted metal, wouldn't all that highly enriched uranium just be buried under thousands of tons of collapsed concrete and dirt?
Problem solved, right? We won the chess game.
That assumption is the exact crux of the strategic failure. Yes, you perfectly destroyed the facility, but because you bombed it, you completely and instantly lost your eyes.
You mean the inspectors?
Exactly. Before the strike, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, had a presence. They had cameras, they had cryptographic seals on the material, they had human inspectors walking the floors, taking measurements.
And after the bomb, the moment the first bomb drops, all of that is gone. The cameras are vaporized, the inspectors are evacuated. You don't have human beings on site taking scientific measurements anymore.
You're completely blind.
Yes, multi-billion-dollar satellites in space can see the crater. They can measure the thermal bloom of the explosion. But a satellite cannot look through 100 feet of smoking rubble and tell you if the thousands of pounds of highly enriched uranium actually melted down in a fire, or if it survived intact inside a reinforced canister.
You successfully caused the blast, but you have absolutely no idea what happened to the actual physical material you were trying to eliminate. The perfection of the weapon created an information black hole.
And that black hole leads directly to what Pape calls the dispersal panic.
It's dispersal panic.
Because the U.S. intelligence apparatus couldn't independently verify the destruction of the uranium, they started relying on what he calls Swiss cheese intelligence. Drips and drabs.
A fragment here, a fragment there.
Right. A fragmented radio intercept here. A satellite image of a suspicious convoy of trucks moving away from the rubble there. It creates a terrifying, unverified picture that Iran is actively dispersing whatever nuclear material survived the blast to hidden locations.
And we need to clarify the stakes of that material.
Sure.
We are not talking about a tiny amount. According to the IAEA estimates right before the strike, Iran had stockpiled enough material for maybe 10 to 16 nuclear bombs.
That's a huge arsenal.
And the terrifying physics of it is that it only takes a fraction of that dispersed material, just a few dozen pounds, to actually make a viable weapon.
So put yourself back in the West Wing. You just launched a massive, globally condemned strike. The president went on national television and confidently stated the threat was obliterated.
Mission accomplished.
Right. But 48 hours later, your intelligence agencies are coming in with fuzzy photos saying, sir, we have a 40% confidence rate that they are surviving uranium in unmarked trucks right now, and we have absolutely no idea where they are going.
That's horrifying.
That immense, crushing uncertainty breeds pure, unadulterated panic in the West Wing.
The illusion of control shatters into a million pieces. You thought your perfect opening chess move won the game, but now the opponent's most dangerous pieces have gone completely invisible and you have no idea what square they are moving to.
Which forces the U.S. into a corner. They can't just sit there, cross their fingers, and hope the uranium's buried under the rocks.
The political risk is just way too high.
It is. The panic sucks them right into the next phase of the escalation trap.
Which brings us to stage 2. This is where we cross the line from a targeted mechanical strike on a facility into a full-blown regime change war. Driven by the blind panic of this missing, unverified uranium, the U.S. escalates.
They feel they have to.
They decide that if they can't find the material, they have to completely dismantle the government that controls it.
And historical data tells us exactly how this trigger gets pulled.
Yeah.
It almost always comes down to the sudden acquisition of exquisite intelligence.
Which means having literal eyeballs on the target, right?
Yes. It's not a vague, probabilistic idea of where a leader might be hiding. Exquisite intelligence is a human agent on the ground, or perfectly intercepted, unencrypted signal intelligence saying the leader is in this specific room in this specific building right now.
That's undeniable.
Pape compares the mechanics of this directly to March 2003. He talks about how CIA Director George Tenet literally ran into the Oval Office to tell President George W. Bush that they had a human agent with a satellite phone standing outside a specific farm watching Saddam Hussein physically sit down for dinner.
Wow. And that level of certainty is a drug for leadership.
Absolutely.
They ordered the strike on that farm immediately. Now, historically, Saddam didn't happen to go to the dinner that night by pure luck, but the existence of that exquisite intelligence is what triggered the massive escalation of the Iraq War.
Exactly.
And that is exactly what happened here last fall. The U.S. and Israeli intelligence services got exquisite down-to-the-hour intelligence on the physical location of the supreme leader of Iran.
And they took the shot.
They did.
They transitioned from destroying centrifuges to an air war for regime change, successfully assassinating the supreme leader. The strategic goal, obviously, is positive regime change. You topple the hostile government, the power structure collapses, and you hope a friendly, democratic one magically takes its place.
But Pape throws a massive, historically backed bucket of cold water on this entire concept. He says that in 100 years of aerial warfare, looking at every conflict since planes were invented, air power alone has never, not rarely, not sometimes, never toppled a regime.
Never, because the mechanics of human psychology dictate that it usually does the exact opposite.
It hardens them.
Yes, when you bomb a capital city and assassinate a leader from the sky, it hardens the power structure. The replacement leaders who step up from the surviving ranks are almost always vastly more aggressive, more hawkish, and willing to take significantly greater risks to prove their strength.
And this explains what Iran did next. They didn't just sit there and surrender.
No.
They didn't try to fight the U.S. military head-on in a conventional tank battle because mathematically they'd be obliterated in an afternoon. Instead, they engaged in a mechanism Pape calls horizontal escalation, the lashback.
They moved the chess game to a completely different board. They asserted control over the Strait of Hormuz.
I want to focus on this because the economics of this are terrifying. Before this war started, Iran controlled roughly 4% of the world's daily oil supply.
A small fraction.
Right. By choking off the Strait of Hormuz, this incredibly narrow, vital waterway that a massive portion of global oil flows through Iran suddenly transformed into what Pape calls a Godzilla oil hegemon. Almost overnight, they went from controlling 4% to effectively controlling 20% of the world's oil supply.
It is a brilliantly calculated, mechanically controlled disruption. We need to understand how they do this.
Yeah, it's not what people picture.
Right? It isn't a physical wall of ships blocking the water. It's a campaign of selective harassment. They use fast attack boats, naval mines, and cheap drones to specifically hit and harass massive oil tankers flagged to the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
And what does that do to the shipping companies?
This instantly causes maritime insurance premiums for those specific routes to absolutely skyrocket, scaring that commercial traffic down to almost zero. The ship owners simply won't risk a $100 million vessel.
Obviously.
But, and this is the genius of the horizontal escalation, they are purposefully letting their own oil, an oil bound for their allies like China and India, flow through the strait completely untouched.
So they were making roughly $1.5 billion every 2 weeks by selling their own oil while actively holding a fifth of the global economy hostage.
Now, a completely natural question that a lot of people in the West ask is, Why didn't the Iranian people just rise up?
Right, because we know there is a massive, deeply courageous pro-democracy movement there. We've seen the protests.
Right.
Why didn't they welcome the U.S. strike that took out the supreme leader and use the chaos to take their country back?
Answering this requires us to really understand the psychology and the historical trauma of the Iranian public. You have to go all the way back to 1953.
The coup.
Right. The CIA and British intelligence actively orchestrated a military coup in Iran, toppling their democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, primarily over oil nationalization.
And they installed the Shah.
They installed the Shah, and the Shah's secret police, the Savak, were notoriously brutal. They tortured and disappeared thousands of dissidents. That historical trauma of Western interference is deeply, deeply ingrained in the cultural DNA.
So even if the society is currently fractured, even if you have a massive portion of the population that desperately wants democracy and viscerally despises the current regime, the psychological dynamic instantly and violently changes when an overwhelming foreign military power attacks from the sky.
It unites them.
Exactly. I want to use a mechanical analogy here to replace some of the cliches we hear on the news. I call it the Godzilla analogy.
I like this one.
Imagine a city that is totally divided. The politicians are corrupt, the citizens are constantly protesting, the police are clashing with civilians, everyone hates the mayor, the society is tearing itself apart. But suddenly, a 300-foot fire-breathing Godzilla rises out of the ocean and starts smashing the skyscrapers.
The internal politics evaporate.
Yeah.
Nobody cares about the mayor anymore.
Exactly. You don't stand in the street holding a protest sign against the mayor when Godzilla is literally stepping on your house. The entire society, no matter how bitterly divided they were 5 minutes ago, instantly unites to fight Godzilla.
Because Godzilla is an existential threat.
Right, to everyone's survival. When the U.S. military, this omnipotent force, attacks a sovereign nation, it becomes Godzilla. It strips away the self-determination of the local pro-democracy movement. The dissidents can't side with Godzilla without instantly becoming traitors to their own nation's fundamental survival.
And this is why Professor Pape grades Iran's coercive strategy in this phase as a B plus naive, maybe an A. They didn't just unite their own people against a foreign attacker. They brilliantly utilized information warfare to frame the entire conflict to the other Gulf states as a war for Israel.
That propaganda move is a masterstroke in regional politics.
It is entirely strategic. They are broadcasting to the populations of countries like Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, saying, if your leaders allow the U.S. to use bases in your country, you are basically paying the economic and blood costs to help Israel conquer the Middle East.
Wow.
And that framing makes those neighboring Arab leaders freeze. It fractures the U.S.-led coalition because those leaders know that if they are seen as aiding that specific agenda, their own populations will riot and potentially overthrow them.
So let's look at the board. Because the precision air power completely failed to topple the regime and actually handed Iran the keys to 20% of the world's oil, the U.S. president is now backed into a terrifying corner.
Stage 3.
The trap has advanced to stage 3. To break this global economic stranglehold, to stop the massive inflation and the supply chain collapse, the president is forced to do the one thing he promised his voters on the campaign trail he would absolutely never do.
Send in American ground troops.
Which brings us from historical theory to the agonizing reality of right now. A U.S. Marine division is currently halfway to the Middle East on transport ships.
They're moving fast.
They are expected to arrive in the theater in the next week or two. The goal is limited territorial conquest. The Situation Room plan is to land Marines to take Karg Island, which is Iran's main oil export terminal, and secure the coastal areas of the Persian Gulf to physically, forcefully reopen the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping.
But we need to look closely at the grim military reality of amphibious assaults. These are universally considered by military historians and tacticians as some of the most dangerous, high-risk, high-casualty operations imaginable.
Pape compared the raw exposure of it to the opening scene of the movie Saving Private Ryan storming Omaha Beach.
Yes, because the fundamental, unavoidable principle of taking ground from the ocean is exposure. To take a beach or an island, the attacking force has to move across open water in massive, relatively slow-moving metal transport ships and landing craft.
You're just sitting targets.
There is zero cover on the surface of the ocean. You can't hide behind a hill. You're completely exposed for hours, maybe a dozen to 20 hours of over-the-horizon transit time.
And think about the modern weapons the Defender has now compared to World War II. The Defender is sitting in camouflaged, reinforced foxholes in the mountains and cliffs along the coast.
Right, they've been preparing for this.
They have been studying every single approach vector, every tide chart for decades. They aren't just shooting machine guns, they're firing advanced anti-ship cruise missiles and launching swarms of explosive drones at those slow-moving ships.
Military doctrine dictates a mathematical reality. A defender sitting in a fortified position automatically has a 3-to-1 advantage over an attacker moving in the open. Our military is phenomenal, they are highly professional, but the brutal math of physical exposure is incredibly hard to overcome.
And here is where the economic stakes become permanent. Even if we succeed, even if the Marines fight their way through the missile barrages, land on Karg Island, and secure the beachhead, the economic escalation crosses a massive line. We move from temporary disruption to lasting, irreversible damage.
This is a critical mechanical distinction that financial markets and cable news anchors constantly misunderstand.
What's the difference?
Disruption is a temporary pause. It's when you hack a pipeline software or knock out the transformers on an electric grid. It causes a brownout. It's highly inconvenient. Prices spike for a few days. But you can reboot the software or replace a transformer in a week or two and get the oil flowing again.
But damage, strategic damage, is when high explosives destroy the actual physical generating halls, the massive pumping stations, or the highly specialized custom-built transmission pipelines that physically load the crude oil onto the tankers.
Exactly. If those massive, specialized pieces of heavy industrial infrastructure are blown up during a firefight, you can't just order a replacement part on Amazon.
Right.
They are bespoke. It takes months, sometimes a year or more, to manufacture the steel, ship it, and rebuild those facilities from scratch.
But wait, I have to ask the obvious logical question here. If Iran is currently making $1.5 billion every 2 weeks by exporting their oil, why on earth would they intentionally destroy their own oil infrastructure or actively bomb the Saudi and UAE infrastructure if the U.S. lacks troops?
It seems counterintuitive.
Why would they destroy the very thing keeping their economy alive?
Because of the grim calculus of ultimate survival. Let me use an analogy here. It's like a hostage taker who is surrounded by police. The hostage taker is demanding $1 million. But the moment the SWAT team kicks in the front door, the money doesn't matter anymore. The hostage taker will set the entire bank on fire just to create chaos and try to escape.
Yeah.
You have to look at it from the Iranian regime's perspective.
Right.
The moment U.S. combat boots physically touch Iranian soil, the regime no longer sees this as a dispute over oil shipping lanes or missing nuclear material. They view it as a beachhead for their total annihilation.
Pape compared their mindset to the German High Command during the Normandy landings in World War II.
Precisely. When the Allied forces landed at Normandy, the Germans knew that even though the Americans were only holding a few miles of sand on the coast, it was the beginning of the end for the entire regime.
They saw the writing on the wall?
If the U.S. takes Karg Island, the Iranian leadership assumes the Marines won't just stop and set up camp. They assume the ultimate goal is marching all the way to Tehran to drag them through the streets.
So long-term oil profits become completely irrelevant in the face of death.
At that point, they do not care about the stability of the global economy, and they certainly don't care about making $1 billion next month because they firmly believe they might be dead next month.
Their strategy shifts entirely.
Their only strategic goal becomes inflicting maximum, unbearable, long-term economic pain on the United States and the rest of the globe. They will blow up the pipelines. They will mine the entire Gulf.
Just burn it all down.
They hope that the economic cost becomes so horrific that the U.S. public panics and forces the president to order a retreat. They will actively try to plunge the world into an OPEC 1973-style massive recession.
Let's briefly explain the mechanics of what an OPEC 1973 recession actually looks like, because younger listeners might just see it as a buzzword.
It's a scary precedent.
In 1973, Arab oil producers enacted an embargo against countries that supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War. It wasn't just that gas got a little more expensive. The price of oil quadrupled almost overnight.
4 times the cost.
We're talking about massive, miles-long lines at gas stations, skyrocketing inflation, and deep economic stagnation that lasted for years. It fundamentally altered the global economy. That is the exact level of pain Iran will try to trigger.
And if the U.S. does successfully land ground troops, take the territory, and absorb that massive economic hit, Pape warns that the historical data guarantees an even darker, delayed reaction.
It doesn't end there.
The trap doesn't stop. This leads us to stages 4 and 5 of the escalation trap, the ultimate consequence, strategic terrorism.
This part of the interview genuinely shocked me. It is based on Professor Pape's groundbreaking 30-year database on suicide terrorism, which he and his team compiled at the University of Chicago after 9/11.
It's incredible work.
They meticulously categorized every single suicide attack globally. It is the most comprehensive, data-driven study of its kind.
And the findings completely upend the conventional wisdom and the public narrative we've been fed for 2 decades. The data definitively shows that 95% of all suicide attacks are not driven by religious fundamentalism.
That completely flips what we hear on the news. I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If it isn't about religion, what is the actual mechanism driving people to blow themselves up?
The data shows that suicide terrorism is overwhelmingly a strategic, calculated response to foreign military ground occupation.
Really?
Yes, it is a tool used by a weaker force to compel a democratic occupying force to withdraw.
He gave the example of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka.
A perfect example.
They were a completely secular Marxist-Leninist group. Religion had nothing to do with their ideology, yet they were the leading practitioners of suicide bombings for years, actually inventing the suicide belt purely as a tactic to fight a military occupation.
Right.
He tracks the origins of Hezbollah and Hamas and points out that their massive suicide campaigns didn't start because of a sudden reading of religious texts. They escalated specifically as a desperate, calculated tactic of last resort against occupying ground forces.
So, applying that historical data to today, if the U.S. parks thousands of Marines on Iranian sovereign territory, stage 4 is mathematically inevitable.
It's just a matter of time.
Within 5 to 8 months of boots hitting the ground, which is how long it takes to organize the logistics, a massive terror campaign will begin. But Pape warns this won't look like what we've seen before. He calls it ISIS on steroids.
I want to unpack the mechanics of that phrase, ISIS on steroids, because it sounds hyperbolic, but the math behind it is chilling.
ISIS, at its absolute peak, was a localized group of maybe 30,000 to 40,000 fighters in the desert.
Right.
Iran is a massive, highly industrialized nation-state. They have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the besieged paramilitary forces. That represents roughly 1 million dedicated, trained members.
1 million personnel. That's an entirely different universe of scale.
Yes. And unlike a terror cell hiding in a cave, Iran possesses highly advanced state-level cyber capabilities, vast financial resources, and sophisticated global propaganda tools.
They can coordinate on a massive scale.
They won't just be commanding attacks directly. They will use encrypted platforms like Telegram to inspire, fund, and instruct highly prepared attacks globally through their massive proxy networks.
And Pape emphasized the preparation aspect. He said the most lethal terror attacks aren't carried out by spontaneous, angry individuals who just grab a weapon one afternoon.
No, those usually fail.
The attacks that do massive systemic damage are meticulously planned over weeks or months. They involve surveillance, logistics, and testing. And a state actor like Iran can orchestrate and fund that kind of deep preparation on indiscriminate civilian targets.
We're talking about simultaneous attacks on shopping malls, commercial airplanes, transit hubs.
And that leads directly into stage 5, which ties the entire nightmare back to the original blind spot.
Back to stage 1.
It brings us back to the missing uranium from stage 1. This is the absolute nightmare scenario for this coming fall. Iran has a massive domestic drone industry. They have produced tens of thousands of precision kamikaze drones. We know they sold many to Russia, but they undoubtedly kept thousands in reserve for themselves. What happens when they take the dispersed, highly enriched uranium, the exact material the U.S. bombed Natanz to destroy, but lost track of in the rubble, and they pack it around conventional explosives and strap it to the tip of a precision drone?
You get a radiological drone, a flying dirty bomb.
Yes. Handed off to highly trained proxy groups like the Houthis in Yemen or Hezbollah in Lebanon, and programmed to target major financial metropolitan areas like Tel Aviv or Dubai.
Let's be clear on the mechanics here. A dirty bomb is not a nuclear explosion.
Right. It doesn't level the city.
No, it doesn't level a city.
Correct.
But the conventional explosive scatters highly radioactive dust over a massive urban area. The panic, the mass evacuations, the total economic shutdown of those financial centers would be unprecedented. You couldn't live or work in those areas for years.
Okay, but let me play devil's advocate here, because a question immediately popped into my head when I was reading the transcript. If suicide terrorism is mostly about fighting off foreign ground troops and not about religion, why aren't Ukrainians strapping bombs to themselves and blowing themselves up in Moscow to expel the Russian army? Russia is actively occupying Ukrainian ground right now.
It's a fantastic question, and it really tests the thesis. Pape addresses it directly. He explains that suicide terrorism is a tactic of absolute last resort.
Last resort.
It only enters the equation when all conventional military means have totally failed against an occupying force. Right now, Ukraine's conventional tactics, their artillery, their own massive drone factories, their standard military combined arms operations are working to hold the line.
They're fighting back normally.
They have essentially fought the Russian army to a brutal, grinding stalemate.
I see the distinction. So because the Ukrainian army is holding their own conventionally and they still have hope of pushing the Russians back with tanks and artillery, they don't need to cross the psychological Rubicon into orchestrating suicide campaigns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if an overwhelming, technologically superior force like the U.S. military completely crushes a much weaker opponent's conventional army in a matter of days and occupies their land, that is when the weaker force realizes conventional fighting is suicide.
So they turn to suicide terrorism as the only strategic lever they have left to inflict pain.
Precisely.
So looking at this incredibly grim chessboard, what does this all mean for the person sitting in the Oval Office?
It's a nightmare for them.
With the trap fully sprung, starting from the intoxicating illusion of the smart bomb, advancing to Iran becoming an oil hegemon, forcing the terrifying necessity of ground troops, and triggering the impending guarantee of massive global terrorism, how does the president actually get out of this?
The brutal historical reality is that there is no golden off-ramp.
None.
There is no scenario where the president gives a triumphant victory speech on an aircraft carrier and everyone cheers. The president is on the horns of an absolute no-win dilemma. He faces two terrible choices.
Let's walk through option A. Push forward. Commit the massive influx of ground troops, take the devastating casualties, secure the Strait of Hormuz by force, and weather the economic storm.
Pape calls this the LBJ problem, directly referring to the political mechanics of President Lyndon B. Johnson during the Vietnam War.
What happened there?
In early 1968, the U.S. military was actually winning almost every conventional tactical battle in Vietnam. The body counts heavily favored the U.S., but then the Viet Cong launched the massive Tet Offensive, attacking dozens of cities simultaneously.
And from a purely military mechanic standpoint, the Tet Offensive was a massive failure for the Viet Cong, right? They lost tens of thousands of fighters and didn't permanently hold any major ground.
Tactically, yes, they were decimated.
Yeah.
But strategically, it was a massive game-changing victory for them.
Why?
Because it completely shattered the political will of the American public. The American people saw the chaos on their televisions. They saw Walter Cronkite essentially say the war was unwinnable. They realized the government's promises of precision control and imminent victory were illusions.
And LBJ took the hit.
The political bottom entirely fell out of LBJ's presidency. The backlash was so fierce he didn't even run for re-election.
So the translation to 2026 is this. If the president pushes forward in Iran, even if the Marines tactically win every single battle, secure Karg Island, and kill thousands of enemy combatants, the domestic reaction will be fatal.
Completely fatal politically.
The massive economic shock of the destroyed oil infrastructure causing $10 a gallon gas, the horrifying images of body bags coming home from amphibious assaults, and the ensuing global terror attacks will lead to absolute political ruin.
It would guarantee a massive blue wave or red wave midterm loss, depending on who is in office. The president's political base will completely fracture because the daily visible costs to the American citizen are simply too devastating to spin.
Okay, so what about option B? The president decides to cut his losses, pull out, abort the Marine landing, tell the aircraft carriers to stand down and just walk away from the theater. Take the embarrassing loss now before it mutates into a generational quagmire.
But look at the mechanics of the negotiation table. If the U.S. signals they want out, Iran isn't just going to smile, shake hands, and say, thanks for stopping. Here's the 20% of the world's oil supply. Back. We'll turn the strait back on.
No, they're not going to just give it up.
Iran holds the ultimate leverage. They have the upper hand.
Right. They are making billions while the U.S. economy is bleeding. So to actually get out and stop the economic bleeding, the U.S. must formally agree to a peace deal. And here's where we hit the most brutal irony of this entire escalation trap.
It's a bitter pill.
To get out right now, the U.S. would have to agree to a diplomatic deal that is mathematically and strategically vastly worse than the Obama-era JCPOA nuclear deal that started this whole cycle of tension.
Let's explain those mechanics.
Yeah.
Under the original JCPOA, Iran had extreme limits on their enrichment. To get a peace deal now, the U.S. would have to publicly concede and let Iran keep enriching uranium at least at 3.5%, basically validating their nuclear program.
They get to keep their progress.
They would have to entirely drop the crippling economic oil sanctions. But crucially, and this is the absolute geopolitical earthquake, Iran will demand that if they're going to open themselves back up to massive, intrusive IAEA inspections, Israel must be forced to do the exact same thing.
This was the biggest aha moment of the entire transcript for me. I want to slow down and really unpack the mechanics of this demand, because it is staggering.
It requires understanding Israel's policy of nuclear ambiguity.
What does that mean?
It is an open secret globally that Israel possesses a robust nuclear arsenal. But as a matter of strict state policy, they never officially confirm or deny it. They have never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which means their nuclear facilities, like the one at Dimona, are completely off limits to international inspectors.
So Iran's checkmate move at the negotiating table is to say, fine, America, you want us to let the IAEA poke around our facilities. Then you have to force your closest ally in the region, Israel, to sign the NPT.
Exactly. It forces tit-for-tat nuclear inspections. If an IAEA inspector gets to walk into Iran's Fordo facility, an IAEA inspector must be allowed to walk into Israel's most highly classified, top-secret nuclear sites.
That's a massive concession.
The United States would have to put unprecedented, massive, incredibly hostile diplomatic pressure on Israel to submit to this, essentially stripping away their policy of ambiguity and exposing their ultimate deterrent.
So I just want to summarize this entire journey. The United States started a war, dropping mathematically perfect, technologically exquisite smart bombs because they refused to accept an imperfect, frustrating diplomatic nuclear deal.
Right.
And after spending billions of dollars, causing global oil prices to explode, risking American lives on foreign beaches, and exposing the world to radiological terrorism, the only way to stop the bleeding is to accept an even worse deal, reward Iran with massive regional power, and humiliate our closest ally by forcing them to submit to nuclear inspections.
If you connect this to the bigger picture, that is the exact terrifying definition of the escalation trap. You pick your poison.
It's lose-lose.
Do you accept massive geopolitical humiliation and betray an ally to stabilize the global economy? Or do you push forward into an unwinnable, bloody quagmire that will destroy your presidency and spawn a generation of terrorists? Pape notes that perhaps a president with elite, once-in-a-generation public relations skills could somehow spin that humiliating peace deal into a win for their political base to survive the news cycle.
Spin it as ending the war.
Right. But from a pure, cold strategic calculus, it is a catastrophic, multi-generational loss.
It is breathtaking how quickly the illusion of perfect control unravels when you map out the mechanics. We started this hour looking at the tactile perfection of a smart bomb drilling a hole into the ground.
Just a single action.
And step by inevitable mechanical step, the trap sprung. The blindness to the aftermath led to an information black hole. The intelligence panic led to the assassination of a leader. The failure of air power handed Iran the keys to a global oil monopoly.
Stage by stage.
That economic blackmail forced the unthinkable deployment of ground troops. And ground troops mathematically guarantee a generation of strategic terrorism.
It is a profound masterclass in why you can never, ever separate clean military mechanics from the messy, unpredictable, fiercely proud reality of human politics. Every single action demands a reaction, and the enemy always gets a vote in how the game ends.
Thank you so much for taking this intense deep dive with us today into Professor Pape's truly sobering analysis. We've spent this hour looking at multi-billion-dollar military strikes, high-stakes diplomacy, and presidents sweating over impossible choices in the Situation Room.
It's heavy stuff.
It is, but I want to leave you with a thought for your own life, because human psychology scales from the Situation Room down to the living room. Think about your own world, your business, the technology you rely on, even your personal relationship.
That's a great point.
How often do we apply a precision fix to a localized problem? Firing a difficult employee, sending a perfectly worded, devastatingly logical email to a coworker, or implementing a strict new rule in your house.
We think we're solving the problem perfectly.
We execute the tactic perfectly, completely blind to the fact that the opponent is going to react. We ignore the messy aftermath, completely unaware that we've just triggered an escalation trap of our own. When is our perfect tactic actually just the very first step toward our own strategic disaster?
Something to really think about.
Until next time.